A Bit Lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds.
Lauren, hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm great. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really good, thank you. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Congratulations on your novel, which we are discussing and celebrating today at certain points we touch. In a moment, I'll get you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about that novel. But I think I've said this to you already, but I want to make sure I say it for the people watching that in addition to all the other reasons why you should get this book and read this book, it's a really good way for people coming out of lockdown and learning again how to meet strangers, how to meet new people. It's like a stranger magnet. It's a really useful book for having conversations on public transport. And I was reading your book just the other day and ended up striking up a conversation with people next to me who were fascinated by what I was doing. And I was lucky enough to be sent a proof copy by your publisher, and then they very kindly sent me a kind of a real copy once it was out. So now I've got like 360 degrees Lauren John Joseph coverage as I walk around. As long as I swing my arms, I'll be able to talk to anybody. So there we go. There's reason enough to get the book, just because it will increase your street cred, very literally. But congratulations on the book, Lauren. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad it's helping you make new friends. That's really why I wrote it. I hope that it gets people laid often and well. Although it does prompt the question, what on earth you were doing whilst you were reading it to get all those people involved? Because most times I'm reading on the tube and no one wants to be my friend. So I don't know what your particular reading style is.
You need to try reading your own book and see if it happens, and you can report back on whether it has the same effect.
Yes, I should, but then they'd be able to compare me to that Jackie Collins-esque author photo in the back, and they'd be like, okay.
So would you mind introducing yourself, Lauren, and tell us a bit about the book before we get stuck into the conversation?
Surely. I'm Lauren John Joseph, and my debut novel is called At Certain Points We Touch. And it centers on a writer who has found themselves in Mexico City and is trying to piece their life back together after the sudden death of a lover. It's a story of friendship, grief, sex, loss, and queer intimacy. And in a way, it's also a love triangle. It's very expansive, and it's also pretty intimate.
I love that summary. Thank you. Can I just ask, who are the members of the love triangle? I'm interested in that idea. Just make sure I've understood.
I would say that the love triangle is between Thomas, the narrator, and Adam. No?
Okay. Yeah, fascinating. I almost wondered if you were thinking about the triangle involving the reader in some ways, because you do speak so directly to us and you are kind of with us through the reading journey in a way that feels really special to this novel. So I wanted to check in just to think through what that triangle was. So Adam, who's another character in the novel.
Yes, it's also been suggested that the third point in the love triangle might be Morgan, the sort of best friend in America. And there is a romantic subplot in there, but that's not the character I think about. But maybe it's a triangulation of triangles. I mean, the author is dead, baby. The reader is Monarch.
Well, hello to you, very undead author. Yeah, absolutely. We can kind of bounce that idea back and forth about whose book this is as we're talking, particularly because I'll probably have ridiculous and unlikely responses to it. Do you mind introducing yourself as well, Lauren, before we turn to the book itself?
Yes, sure. So I'm Lauren John Joseph, and I am an artist who works with the written word across the page, the stage, and the silver screen. I've made solo performance work for about a decade, and I have also written for various publications, written criticism and essays, and also a prose volume and plays, and have also written short films. And this is my debut novel.
Thank you very much. That's a modest but brilliant summary of all of the incredible things that you've done. I've absolutely loved reading the book and have been blown away by it. And you talk about it being a book about friendship and grief and loss. And I guess only one of those things feel positive in terms of their kind of emotional affect. And one thing that really struck me with the book is that it is a book about loss and bereavement, but it's the most incredibly alive book, constantly asking us to think about what it means to be alive and to remember and to exist now. And I guess that was kind of my opening question for you, is how did you end up writing such an incredibly life-affirming book about something so sad?
I guess I'm just an upbeat kind of gal. I don't know. I am so surprised that it turned out to have such a dry sense of humor, and that so many people have said, so many readers have said that it's very funny. And I would put that down, honestly, to coming from Liverpool and the specific sense of humor that is involved there, even in the worst of times. When I was a kid, I can remember my stepfather taking a hammer and destroying everything in the house. Dishes, windows, the fishbowl, the television, everything was in pieces, in shards. It was terrifying. And the neighbor came around from next door. She was hoovering up and she said, "Friggin' hell, you're going to be finding bits of glass in your carpet for months here." And it's kind of hilarious and true, and also devastating at the same time. But it sort of ameliorated the horror of it all. And honestly, it's kind of a natural way of writing and talking to me now. Have you just noticed that like the sun has come out and given me this cruciform image across my face? I mean, like making sure I'm keeping my Lenten promise. I don't know what to do about this.
I think we should keep it as it is, unless you want to move from left
Maybe
to
I'll
right.
try to close the curtain. What's happened? Oh, God. Is this going to be a problem for you in the edit, that the lighting state changes?
I don't know if they said this 2,000 years ago, but I feel like the cross is only doing you favors, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But is it blinding you? Are you all right?
I mean, I can move to the side or something, can't I?
Yeah. As long as you're happy, shout if it starts blinding you too much.
It is pretty bright. Honestly, I thought that was done at 4, but I guess not.
We're in that weird point in the year where the sun suddenly starts showing up unexpectedly, just when you think it's gone, like a horror movie villain. It's making me think about light in your book as well. There's an amazing moment in the book where I think it's post-coital. You've seen the boy you mentioned. Sorry, I'm saying you. The narrator has seen the boy, the lost love, and is then covered in sunlight in a way which I think is described as letting the sun have its way with me.
You mean in the scene in San Francisco where the narrator's on the floor in the living room?
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's true. There's a lot of play with light and reflection in this book.
And the range of references across the book in general have really taken me. The writing feels so fluid and easy, and yet I was also doing some really wonderful learning across the book as I frantically Googled the occasional thing. So I've done a lot of learning, and you take us from 18th century dandies to kind of romantic and modernist art and music, early to mid 20th century film. And at the same time, the book is very in dialogue with contemporary writing, particularly perhaps American contemporary writing. Do you mind telling us a bit about that range of references?
Yeah, so I wanted this narrator to be really trying to explore the predicament that they were in, and in a way to turn to all of these systems of knowledge to try and figure out how they were going to get over what they couldn't face. So, maybe they try and get through it by reading about quantum physics or history or art history or the Bible. And so they're constantly trying to study and learn as a way to put off the thing they don't want to face, but also as a sort of strategy to try and find a way out of it. So it is this constant grab bag of maybe this is the door I'll go through and this will get me out of it. But also I wanted it to have a sort of purgatorial feel in a way that the narrator was in some sort of waiting room, and all the knowledge of the universe was there, like in that sort of Jungian idea that our job on earth is to collect information and that it all goes back to the collective unconscious. So I feel like they're surrounded by all of this knowledge, which they're trying to take a piece of and make sense of in light of what they'd gone through. And maybe not entirely successfully, because it's sort of like they can't get over this tragedy until they put all that to the side and just face it and just sit at the table and write and just hold those old love letters in their hand and just stop distracting themselves in a way, stop putting it off, like when you get sober, when one gets sober, you know.
Yeah, fascinating. And likewise, Lauren, the Similes, it feels like a very similarly self-conscious and similarly heavy book, not heavy, but rich. And again, this is a narrator who thinks via simile. I wondered if you have ways of talking us through some of those practices for the narrator.
I would say that's more to do with my authorial voice coming through and less a sort of strategy for the character.
Okay.
I've honestly never assessed my use of language. I do it all almost musically. I just write a sentence till it sounds right. Which is interesting because I'm also a pretty good singer, but I could not tell you anything about music. You just do it till it sounds right. So I think a lot of the similes come from that, just from the image that I have in my head matching how the sentence should sound to me. And I think that a lot of times that throws up things which are pretty incongruous, and which is potentially why they work.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the early similes in the book are strikingly violent in places where the narrative doesn't yet feel like it has violence, and then suddenly they seem to open up into this kind of really generous expansion of cross comparison, some of which feel gloriously cheeky, like when you describe one of your characters as acting like a Truman Capote character. And
yes.
It's kind of certainly making my head turn all sorts of spirals in terms of where I sit in relation to that, where you sit in relation to that, where the narrator sits in relation to that.
Yeah, I like the Capote reference because obviously he often spoke in his mid and later career of the non-fiction novel. And obviously other people have used that term, maybe Norman Mailer, but Truman Capote was stepping into it and queering it in a way, which is kind of what he'd done with his whole life. I often think that Truman Capote's whole life was a non-fiction novel. You know, he'd created himself and he was his own work. Yeah, so of course I love that the comic sadness of Truman Capote, of his own life, but expressly in his work. So yes, when I was talking about that character Elsa as living like a Truman Capote character, I had someone like a Holly Golightly in mind, I suppose.
Fascinating. So many of these references get us to think about other kinds of artistic and creative expression. And you're just talking about singing and writing a sentence until it sounds right. And my goodness, you've done that. And there's a moment, maybe, I don't know, about a sixth of the way into the book, where the reader is asked to think about everything happening in the novel as compared to what it's like to watch a film, to be in an art exhibition, to be in between mirrors, which are echoing backwards and forwards, the reflection of the person in between them. And then you turn the page into the next chapter and we're being asked to think about late night movies specifically that we're watching in a hotel room. So you're constantly kind of replacing us, putting us in different ways to think about the reading that we're doing. Yeah, again, I'd love to hear more about what you're trying to do to your reader, what you're trying to do to your writing in those moments.
I think that's about framing the scene and constantly sort of trying to drive home this point about the artificiality of memory and the story, you know, that how the memory that we have is kind of the memory that we've told ourselves. And then it goes on to be like the dominant narrative of that experience. And you have this loop between the narrative you've created and the narrative you remember. So yeah, I'm constantly interested in reframing the story right throughout the book. There's the scene in the nightclub where the narrator is in the nightclub watching an act on stage, and whilst they're remembering being there, they're remembering having been there and remembering something further back. So you're constantly getting this sort of like mise en abîme, mise en abysm, however you say this. I don't speak French. Like picture in a picture effect. Throughout also when the narrator's talking about Mexico City, how under the cathedral is the Mexica city, but the Mexica city itself is 6 cities on top of each other. So just constantly shifting the frame to talk about the impossibility of looking back, because the present isn't fixed, and so neither is the past. And every time you look back on the past from a different point of view, through a different lens, through a different frame, it's shifted. And so continually looking back on the past, you're continually having to sort of run to keep up with the past. And I felt like to constantly offer all of these frames was a way of heightening that, of really making that point clear. And also to be sort of cinematic. You know, I really love movies, and I feel like one of the things that defines a movie is the frame. And so I wanted to, you know, frame scenes and frame narratives in an almost cinematic way.
Absolutely. But I guess what's different between the novel you've given us and a film, perhaps this isn't different, but we feel so close to the narrator as they're working things through at their coffee table, is it, where they're working? They've rushed back home to write all this down. And that proximity that we have to them, it feels like that would be quite hard to achieve through another medium, perhaps.
Yes, I think it would be impossible in anything besides a novel, because there's an intimacy in novel writing. And also for a novel, you know, you're sort of forced to spend quite a lot of time with the characters and in the reading of it. You know, a movie's over and done in an hour and a half, 2 hours, but you spend a lot of time with characters in a novel. So you can really build up a rapport that doesn't really work in any other medium. And I suppose that's why the story lent itself so well to this format.
Yeah, thank you. And that makes me think too of how the book is constantly asking those questions about how writing is or is not like singing or dancing or a film. And it's kind of gloriously self-contradictory on that point, in that it has moments where it's very clear that writing is its own separate medium. But then partly because of these constant similes, it's always saying the opposite thing as well. The narrator at one point kind of reflects on their ability to perform in other kinds of genres, other kinds of outlets for creativity. Yeah, I don't know if you had thoughts about where all that is sitting.
Yes, it's definitely a contradictory novel. I wanted to try and put across a sense of contradiction and frustration in the writing process, with the narrator looking back and making sort of rash statements and being almost obnoxious at times, saying terrible things about people or terrible things about certain cities, especially London. But that to be that contradiction and that frustration to sort of be more expressive of their own, you know, psychology at that point of time. Yeah. And whilst they're telling their story. And also the contradictions, I think, stand for a sort of learning curve on the part of the narrator, that they move through feelings about certain things, and we watch them do that. We watch them come to a different understanding of their own past, of their relationship with their mother, of who it is they feel themselves to be and what it is they feel capable of doing. Again, this kind of intimacy that's possible with a novel. Is
it possible to think as well about how that intimacy works or doesn't work with Thomas, the object of the narrator's love, in that one of the really striking things about the novel is how unintimate we get to be with Thomas? It's almost like the narrator is kind of storing him up for themselves and not for us as readers. And we get quite carefully managed glimpses of what Thomas is like and how much time the two central characters actually spend together. There's a moment right at the end of the novel where we hear about JJ and Thomas watching videos at a mate's house. And I realized that was the first time I think that I'd been offered a chance to see them other than having sex on their own or at a party with lots and lots of people around them, this kind of middle world of just having a normal relationship. We get the intimacy with JJ, and we get something quite different, I think, with Thomas.
Yes, that little scene at the end is the sort of what could have been, I suppose, if they were to ever have reached what comes next after the initial attraction and drama, if they would have ever pushed through that or made it through that. So that's a little glimpse of something that never was or could never be, and it's right up against the sort of dramatic resolution of Thomas's death. Yeah, but yes, I think the narrator is definitely stage managing this love affair with an eye on all of the passion and all of the drama, you know.
Yeah, fascinating. The novel also feels like a kind of a review of the prehistory of what it's been like to be in lockdown during COVID, in its extraordinary remembrances of what it was like to communicate online in the 2000s and the 2010s. And the novel has, at some places, quite a hostile relationship with technology. And hilarious, he says at one point, at least people have stopped reading because of technology. This is the one good thing about technology. And then another point almost thinks of technology as a kind of religious good. Could you tell us a bit about that relationship with tech?
Yes, I mean, I think probably all of us feel that technology is a great thing and a terrible thing. I mean, we're talking right now thanks to technology, but we're never left alone for a moment because of technology. Yes, the narrator definitely has a complicated relationship with it, sees it as a sort of necessary evil and potentially a sort of liberating tool, but then also like an object of torture because they're constantly trying to Google old pictures or look for one more email. So yeah, they really put themselves through the ringer. The technology really becomes an instrument of torture for them, but also something of a bridge because they travel so often and they reach out to Thomas or Thomas reaches out to them via technology, you know, instant messaging and whatever. And lots of talk about MySpace, which which was actually something I was, you know, heavily involved with. I loved MySpace in the old days, and I thought that it would be kind of funny in a novel that's so into exploring the past and ancient history, to try and visit something like MySpace as if it were, you know, an exhibit in the British Museum, and give it that kind of weight because, you know, social media has changed everything for everybody in the world. And even though we sort of laugh it off and say, oh, it's just, you know, a Kardashian trying to sell lipstick, it's just memes, it has really changed humankind, you know, in a really brief period of time. And because of its power, we give it a lot of we how would I say that? Because of its influence, we give it so much power and think of it as being maybe indestructible. But if you forget the password to one of your accounts, or, you know, if that platform is erased, as happened with MySpace, it's all gone. All of those memories and pictures are just gone. We put so much faith in the digital world, and think, oh no, if I put that online, it'll be there forever. But it won't. And it can be kind of a rude awakening if you become a little digital historian and try to find things online, because a lot of those things are not there, and it makes us forgetful and it makes us a bit blasé maybe. Yeah, and so it's in talking about what we lose so easily, it sort of draws a line under the importance of what we remember, you know.
Yeah, what we remember, and the spaces it affords for grief, but also underlining how much we lose, including online records and images of the people that we love. But it's also kind of becomes a medium where Thomas pursues JJ. So kind of without technology, like it's almost as if JJ loses Thomas multiple times over and goes through different kinds of grieving processes, and then it's Thomas choosing to come back
Yes.
each time through various forms of tech flirtations.
Yes, and even after Thomas's death, there's kind of a digital haunting that goes on, because Thomas lingers online and in the newspapers, which is, I guess, is another form of technology. Yes, and then, as I said, the narrator goes on to try and punish themselves by trying to dig up more online, and that is a very finite resource which can never match their obsession, really.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really fascinated by Thomas and how much and how little time, as I say, the reader gets to spend with them, and how much time we spend with them in which they're having sex. And I think I've already said to you that I love the narrator's description of Thomas's body. Thomas has a contemptuous torso, we're told at one point. Hate those. And we hear about the assortment of dilettantes, the parades of holes and protuberances, the fuck parade that make up Thomas's life as seen through JJ's eyes. Yes. I love all of those phrases. Can you tell us a bit about... Go on, sorry.
I was just thanking you for being so complimentary.
Well, I think they're all they're so wonderful at placing us in that world. Do you mind talking us through firstly what it means to have your kind of the second character in a novel almost entirely defined by their sex life, but you might want to correct me on that. But it feels like their sex life and their sexual selves is kind of what we get of them. And then this kind of ghostly presence of all of that person's other lovers that we get to hear about, kind of that's not even a second hand, a third hand, I guess, via JJ.
Yeah, yes. I mean, Thomas is definitely a sexual person, and his sex is writ large over his life. But he's also a photographer, and he's also someone who's keenly interested in architecture and very involved with nightlife. I think that sex seems the most prominent corner of his character, because maybe he just has a lot more sex than most people, with a sort of wider variety of people. I suppose sex is what brings the two characters together, and it's also one of the key concerns of the novel is sex, and Thomas is really the sort of major avatar for that. And in writing about all the other people that Thomas was having sex with, it sort of allows it to be seen that the narrator is not like a sexually jealous person. So when the love triangle develops and there's the emotional fallout of that, it's not because the narrator is a prude and is saying, how could you be having sex with him? Because the narrator is well aware that this is no kind of monogamous you for me and me for you situation. And that just kind of complicates things, that the real kicker is not sexual infidelity. It's an emotional crisis, really, because I think that the queer identities are often framed as being purely and only sexual, and so this is an attempt to say, yeah, sex is great, sex is a magical, wonderful, powerful thing, but there is more to queer lives than that, without saying, no, please, let's not mention sex. I'm trying to be sex positive and say, and then, or yes, and, as you say in improv classes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wonder what both Thomas and JJ would make of that, because they both have such different approaches to and assumptions about sex. And Adam, that third member of a triangle, if I remember rightly, does think of himself as in a monogamous relationship, and so they've all got kind of different expectations and understandings of what it is to have sex, to be dating someone, and what have you. But yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think Thomas would be absolutely horrified by that kind of explanation, I think Thomas really follows his libido, and that's pretty much the end of it. Libido and ego, I would say, and probably JJ would agree with that assessment, but yeah, I think they'd probably agree with it, but probably also say, oh no, there's something much more mystic and powerful about it than all that, because they do have moments of being like a real romantic fiction kind of gal.
And how does that connect, Lauren, to Thomas's strange, unarticulated relationship with gender and sexuality? Thomas seems massively homophobic at places, massively pro-queerness and queer sex in other places, seems to see gender at some points and seems not to see it at others. Again, we're seeing that all through JJ's eyes, but could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I would say that in the way that the narrator has tried to figure out how to deal with the tragedy in their life through art history, physics, the Bible, etc. I don't think Thomas really knows himself all that well, and is at parties and is causing mischief and is fucking everybody. And that's kind of a way to keep trying to learn about himself at a distance, keep himself at arm's length from himself. So it's a wonderful kind of distraction. I think it's a subconscious technique that he uses in order to avoid himself and to avoid ever really getting to grips with who he is or who he might be or what he might want.
Yeah, thank you. And to cycle back to the start of a conversation and connect sex to the world of similes in this novel, sex does get caught up in those wonderful similes that we were talking about at the outset. There's a moment where to fuck is to farm, for example, and we hear about kind of seedlings grow, etc. Do you mind telling us about that idea? Unpacking that for us.
I think that idea is actually more about relationships than particularly about sex. The narrator's talking about a couple of relationships and saying that the harvests of those relationships had been bad because those harvests the crops hadn't been tended to well. But in this relationship, like in the sowing of the seed was also, from the very start, they had sowed hatred in with love. So it was always going to be a nightmare and a disaster. There was no possible other crop but the crop we get in this novel.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. And then there's kind of one final moment I wanted to make sure we dwell with, but I want to hand over to you and ask if there are things that we haven't covered you'd like us to, because it's such an enormous novel and I'm aware we haven't got very far at all, thanks to my tiny questions. But the kind of one final thing I wanted to make sure I asked you about was, there are two incredible moments in which the novel kind of thinks beyond itself and uses that your incredible power with similes to think outside of a novel. And JJ talks about their robust, selfish style, which they nevertheless squeeze into other people's wardrobes. And then I turn the page, and just on the next page, people are at a party with lots of famous people around, and it's compared to being at a party at Madame Tussauds, as if the waxworks have come to life. And again, the novel's constantly pushing us into new kinds of contexts. But I wonder if those are kind of metaphors for the writing style in the novel, in that squeezing into other people's wardrobes whilst maintaining a robust and very, not selfish, but kind of self-aware attitude to style. It feels like exactly how this novel is operating from sentence to sentence.
Yes, I think in reference to squeezing into other people's wardrobes, that's the narrator looking back at themselves and thinking, oh, wait, I've totally misunderstood this. I've misrecognized myself all this time. I thought that I knew what I was doing and I had this robust sense of style, but really I was just grasping for available resources. Whoever I was staying with, I would be like, oh, what's in your wardrobe? And then they'd put it on. But it is a book that's very self-conscious about style. There's many depictions of what people were wearing and why they wore it and how they'd sort of used that to build up their personality. And yeah, style is something I'm very interested in, both in terms of like fashion, but also, you know, literary style. And a lot of the outfits that the narrator is wearing are kind of like a bricolage themselves. So there'll be descriptions of like some high-waisted 70s pants that were found on the street and a friend's t-shirt. But then a like very expensive Dior $40 mascara when they're basically starving. And these kind of contradictions and little quizzical pieces of jigsaw, or the scene where they end up getting dressed up as a Barbra Streisand dinosaur hybrid. You know, throughout there's all these mad outfits, or Thomas's combination of like half schoolboy PE kit and then like a 90s rave throwback. These kind of like collages, style collages are very deliberate, because I think that's also happening with the language, that it moves between all of these different registers of slang, like Scouse, queer slang, and then like high Catholic language, and then all of these similes, and then kind of like pretty raunchy register as well. And it's constantly moving through these in a kind of, yeah, like collage, bricolage style, because I'm interested in like a sort of queer materiality, I suppose, in a way that comes through in, you know, like Fairbanks or Henry James or Schola von Reinhold more recently, perhaps. How there's a certain sort of queer tone to writing, which comes through in very verbose, like a florid writing, which is seemingly very Baroque, you know. And so I'm interested in that for sure, and especially coming at it from like a non-binary and a trans perspective, because the big figures, you know, like Fairbanks or Henry James, write through a very specific lens, and then myself or say Schola von Reinhold are looking at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because as you were talking about florid and Baroque, I was thinking that that's not how I would describe the novel at all. And I can see how it has kind of florid and Baroque flirtations, but its fluency feels, I think I'd go back to your description of yourself as a singer and how you want to get the sentences so that they sound good. And yeah, it feels a step away from Henry James stylistically, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I mean, just at the level of sentence length. And it just feels, it has a kind of generosity to the reader's fluent ease from sentence to sentence, I think, than Henry James does.
For sure. I mean, I love Henry James, but I was very keen that even with the most complicated ideas or the most complicated setups, that I wanted them to be readable, because I wanted to keep a kind of immediacy. So even if there are several really complex ideas in a sentence, I wanted there to be a sort of mellifluous quality that carried the reader through, which I don't think was exactly Henry James's agenda.
And I have to say, I mean, for me, that was what especially blew me away about the novel is that the complexity of its reach and the generosity of its spirit and its kindness and welcoming us into this completely new world. I don't think I've read a novel. I'm not a quick reader. I don't think I've ever read a novel as quickly. So I kind of found myself shooting through these incredible sentences and learning more and more about the world of a novel, and then the world of the references of the novel as well.
Wow.
Lauren, is there anything more you'd like us to talk about before we wrap up? We've been talking about my response to the novel, but I'd be much more interested to hear about your own.
Well, I think I would say, in response to your last point, that this welcoming tone is, I feel, very necessary, because I am asking people to come into a world that's at times pretty raucous. Not only is it extremely sexually graphic, but it deals with a lot of troublesome issues, and it can be heavy at points as well, and violent. But also, I didn't want to have to explain anything. I didn't want to have to be like, have you guys ever heard about they, them pronouns? I didn't want to have to do any of that. And I felt like if I was very welcoming and just opened the book and said, come with me, and was kind and inviting, that all of those things that maybe people weren't familiar with, they would get familiar with just through this, like, as you're saying, this act of generosity. And without being didactic, because that is honestly such a turnoff.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to hear that I'm not far off in your own point of view about that, because that generosity and kindness and welcoming spirit just feels so encompassing throughout the novel. And I remember thinking actually at the start that will be the one thing that would be impossible to sustain over a novel of such length, but you somehow did it. It never stops.
That's really good to hear, because it is, I mean, by the standards of contemporary novels, I guess it is long, but it's not. Hanya Yanagari. Why do I never say that woman's name right? Hanya Yanagari.
I'm not going to say it right either. Sorry.
Those books, or Donna Tartt. It's not 600 pages, not 800 pages, but yeah, it's lengthy, and it was important to me, but also really difficult to keep that tone going, and also having written in this almost direct address, to keep that going without it becoming a gimmick.
And is that a direct address, do you think, to JJ themselves, or is it to us? I kind of felt like I had different sense of that at different moments, whether they're talking to themselves or to us. I
think that they're actually talking to Thomas. I think throughout, when they're saying, "You approached me," etc. Yeah. I think it's always to Thomas.
Lauren, thank you so much, both for the book and for the conversation about the book. Like I say, I've learned tons from the book, but I've learned tons as well today. I'm really grateful for your time, and congratulations on the book. And I can't wait to see the reception it's got coming its way.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. This has been a real pleasure.
Good. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.